The bees move with a rhythm I've come to rely on. Their hum is steady, almost musical, as they weave between rows of white wooden hives under the Oregon sun. I stand still among them, gloved hands gripping a smoker, the scent of pine and honey in the air. This place, our little farm just outside Corbett, doesn't ask questions. It doesn't demand anything but presence. The bees don't care who I used to be or what I've lost. They only care that I show up steady and calm and let them do what they were born to do. It wasn't always like this. I didn't grow up with peace in my bones. I grew up on Belmont Street in a narrow white house with a porch that sagged at the steps and a wooden fence my brother and I painted every summer until the brush blistered our hands. The house looked warm enough from the outside, but inside it always felt colder than it should have. My father, Stuart, was the kind of man who wore a tie on weekends and ironed his socks. He kept his voice measured and his smile thin. Everything about him seemed carefully folded like the bills he counted at the bank. I never heard him laugh, not in the way you imagine fathers laughing loud, unguarded. When he did smile, it was usually after correcting someone. My mother, Valerie, filled our house with flowers and perfume and friends she didn't really like. She was the kind of woman who changed outfits 3 times before going to the grocery store. She'd lean in for a kiss, but her hugs were always stiff, like she didn't want her hair to be touched. She had this sharp way of talking even when she was trying to sound sweet, and somehow every compliment came wrapped in warning. Micah was 4 years younger, softer around the edges than me, and always watching with those big, curious eyes. I think he saw things I didn't want to see yet. I took it upon myself to shield him from the worst of it. When our parents fought over money or something worse, I'd crank up the TV or take him outside to throw a ball until his hands ached. He thought I was protecting him. Maybe I was just distracting myself. We both knew early on that money in our house wasn't real. It appeared for new cars and disappeared before tuition forms came around. Our parents spent like nothing ever ran out, like bills were myths other people worried about. Micah and I quietly learned to fill the gaps. I mowed lawns. He folded laundry. We were kids pretending to be the grown-ups our parents never bothered to become. At 17, I knew I had 2 choices: stay in that house and suffocate, or leave and try to save us from the outside. I chose the latter. A recruiter set up a table outside the community college with a stack of pamphlets and promises. I didn't even hesitate. I signed the enlistment papers on a Tuesday, and by Friday I was telling my family. Dad barely blinked. Mom asked if the uniform would fit my shoulders. Only Micah hugged me, holding on like he already knew something I didn't. He whispered, "You have to be careful, Eli." I nodded and told him I'd be back soon, but I didn't come back the same. Boot camp tore me down before it built me back up. Every day was a storm, blisters, sweat, yelling, but beneath the grind, something solid began to take shape. I learned to hold a line, to think clearly under pressure, to keep breathing, even when everything inside screamed otherwise. The Army didn't fix me, but it gave me something to hold on to: structure, purpose, routine. And in the spaces between drills and deployments, I held tightly to the thought of Micah. I kept a photo of us in my locker, 2 kids on the porch, smiling like the world hadn't happened yet. From the beginning, I sent most of my paychecks home. It felt like duty, like paying back a debt I hadn't asked for, but somehow owed. I imagined the money going toward Micah's textbooks, groceries, maybe fixing up the house. The calls from home were brief but consistent. Mom would mention the rising utility bills, Dad would mutter about the car needing new brakes. I'd wire the money, no questions asked, sometimes all of it keeping just enough to buy soap and socks. Micah, though his letters were different, they were handwritten, full of scratchy lines and gratitude. He said college was harder than he expected, but that my help was keeping him afloat. He didn't ask for much. He just thanked me. Every word in those letters was like a balm, a reminder that maybe this was all worth it. But over time, the tone of the calls changed. My mother stopped mentioning bills and started talking about comfort, a vacation she needed, a party they were throwing for neighbors. My father casually asked for more, said they were thinking about redoing the kitchen. I tried to reason with them, told them my income hadn't grown, but the response was sharp. "You're the eldest son," Mom snapped. "It's your responsibility." I should have said no. I should have drawn a line. But I didn't. I kept wiring the money, telling myself they just didn't know how to ask gently. That families sometimes take more than they give. It wasn't until my second leave, 2 years in that reality hit hard. I walked through the front door with my duffel and boots still dusty. Sitting in the driveway was a brand-new SUV polished to a mirror shine. My name was on the insurance paperwork. Inside, Micah was hunched over his laptop wearing a fast food uniform, his eyes bloodshot from a double shift. I didn't say much that visit. Just sat in the kitchen long enough to hear my mother rave about the car's leather seats while Micah quietly reheated leftovers. I caught his eye once, and he gave me a look I couldn't name. It wasn't disappointment. It was resignation, like he'd stopped expecting better a long time ago. That night, lying awake on the couch, I realized something I couldn't unlearn. In Syria, the air was always heavy dust heat, a stillness that felt unnatural. That day, the sun sat high and cruel as we rolled down a narrow road in the lead Humvee. I was scanning maps, checking in over the radio, listening to Jake talk about his girlfriend back home and the dog they'd just adopted. He always talked like the war couldn't touch him. I envied that. We hadn't seen another soul for miles. That should have been the first sign. Too quiet. No kids on rooftops. No street vendors. Just wind and sand and a tension that crept into my jaw. Then the world exploded. I remember the sound before the pain, a hollow crack, then the roar of fire. The Humvee flipped. I was weightless for half a second before everything slammed back down. Smoke filled my lungs. Blood soaked my right leg. Jake was pinned, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth slightly open like he still had something left to say. I tried to drag him out, but he was limp, dead weight. I screamed his name. Nothing. My own body wouldn't listen either. A searing pain in my leg told me something had torn loose bone flesh, maybe all of it. I was losing blood fast. I remember sand sticking to it and the heat, and then the sky going black as someone yelled over the calm Coleman down. "We need a medevac." They airlifted me out. I came to in a hospital in Germany, sterile and white and quiet. A doctor told me what I already knew. They'd taken the leg below the knee. Too much damage. I'd be fitted for a prosthetic. Discharged. PTSD. They said it like it was a diagnosis you could fold and put in a drawer. The flashbacks came fast and without warning. I saw Jake's face when I closed my eyes, heard the explosion in the quiet of night. Every loud noise turned my spine to wire. I didn't want therapy. I didn't want to talk. I wanted to disappear into something simple and still. They offered meds. I flushed most of them. When I got off the plane in Portland, I didn't feel like I was home. I felt like a stranger borrowing someone else's body. Micah met me at the gate, older now, face sharper, voice steadier. He didn't flinch at the crutches, just hugged me tight, his hand trembling on my back. "You made it back," he whispered. I nodded. That was all I had. Our parents were waiting at the house. Mom burst into tears when she saw the metal leg. Dad gave me a handshake like I was a client. They said all the right things. "We're proud of you. You're a hero." We were so worried, but none of it reached their eyes. They'd set up a room for me on the ground floor. The walls were still the same color I painted in high school. The bed was too small. The silence after the greetings was louder than any welcome. I unpacked slowly my old photo of Micah and me still at the top of the bag. I placed it by the window, sat on the bed, and stared at the ceiling while the muffled sound of laughter drifted up from the living room. I tried. That's the part I always come back to. I really tried. I kept my head down, helped where I could. I washed dishes, folded laundry, even vacuumed, dragging my prosthetic leg awkwardly across the rug while my mother criticized the pattern lines. I told myself this was temporary, that healing would come in the silence between obligations. I looked for work. Applied at a hardware store, a few security jobs, even asked a friend of a friend about warehouse shifts. I finally landed a job at a supermarket, posted at the entrance in a cheap uniform scanning bags and nodding at strangers. It wasn't much, but it was something until the fireworks. A festival down the block sent the first explosion. Just a firework, nothing dangerous. But my body didn't know that. I dropped to the floor behind a counter, gasping, heart racing, every nerve pulled tight. Customers stared. My manager called the paramedics, but I refused the ambulance. They fired me the next week. When I told my father, he didn't even look up from his paper. "You were a soldier," he said. "Now you can't even handle noise." "You're not a soldier, you're a cripple." I didn't respond. What was there to say? I still gave them my pension. Not that it was much. I sent what I could, handing it over like rent for a place I didn't feel welcome in. They never said thank you. It was expected. Christmas Eve came with fake smiles and forced traditions. The tree was trimmed, the table set. Micah was working late. He'd taken extra shifts to afford a bus ticket home. I'd spent weeks saving small bits of my pension to buy gifts. A hand-knitted scarf for my mother. A modest watch for my father. I wrapped them carefully and placed them under the tree, nervous like a child. They opened them slowly. My mother held the scarf like it was a piece of trash someone had left on her chair. "This is nice," she said, voice flat. "But really, Elias, you didn't need to try so hard." My father turned the watch over once and set it on the table without a word. Then came the silence. Long and uncomfortable. "You think these make up for what you've become," my mother said finally. "You're not the son we were once proud of." I stared at her, not blinking. "If you can't contribute to this family," my father added, "you'd better leave. We don't need a burden here." I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. Micah wasn't there to pull me aside this time, so I stood, quietly, methodically. I went to my room, packed the few clothes I had, the photo of Micah and me and a toothbrush. That was it. I didn't argue, didn't yell. I walked out into the snow, the cold slicing through my coat, and I didn't stop walking until the house disappeared behind me. I didn't know where I was going, only who I wouldn't be walking back to. I didn't think much as I boarded the bus. The driver barely glanced at my ID. I took a seat near the back, pulled my coat tighter around me, and watched the Christmas lights of town fade behind the frost-covered window. I hadn't spoken to Grandpa Alden in years. My parents had kept their distance from him, always calling him eccentric or bitter. But I remembered him from when I was a kid, quiet hands, a rough laugh, and the smell of beeswax always clinging to his flannel shirts. When I called him, all I said was, "I don't have anywhere else to go." He didn't pause. "Come on home, Elias. Door's open." He was already there when the bus pulled into the tiny stop near the county road. Leaning against an old pickup, his shoulders sloped, his face leaner than I remembered. But his eyes, steady, unbothered, were exactly the same. He didn't flinch when he saw the crutches, didn't ask questions, just nodded, opened the passenger door, and said, "Let's get you warm." The ride was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for conversation. The farmhouse sat just beyond a hill of pines, tucked between fields where snow had settled like a sheet. Rows of wooden bee boxes lined the edge of the clearing, neat and silent in the cold. The house was small, but smelled like something real, coffee cedar, old books. He showed me to a spare room, said I could stay as long as I needed, then left me alone. That night I woke in a sweat. The same dream sand blood, Jake's blank eyes. But outside my door, waiting, was a mug of tea still steaming. He never asked about the nightmares, never mentioned the leg. He just handed me gloves the next morning and said, "We'll check the hives after breakfast." It was slow work, careful, nothing like the life I'd just come from. But the bees had a rhythm. They weren't confused. They weren't cruel. They moved with purpose, each knowing what it had to do to keep the colony alive. No waste, no betrayal. Over time, I fell into the rhythm too, cleaning the frames, watching for signs of disease, replacing queens when a hive grew restless. Every part of it required stillness, something I hadn't had in years. One evening, after we closed up the sheds, Grandpa sat beside me on the porch and said, "Your folks took everything I had saved for retirement, told me it was a loan, never saw a dime of it again." He didn't sound angry, just tired, like someone who had already let go of the weight. I didn't say anything, just sat there listening to the distant hum of bees in the trees, feeling something in my chest begin to shift. I started waking up before the sun. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The bees needed checking the frames, rotated, the hives cleaned. Grandpa let me lead, stepping back little by little. He was patient, never corrected with force, just asked quiet questions that made me figure it out on my own. Over time, the hum of the bees became familiar, even comforting, like a kind of low-living heartbeat that never judged me. With what I had left in my account, I bought a few basic sensors to monitor temperature and humidity inside the hives. Nothing fancy, just enough to alert us when something was off. I watched online tutorials, read forums, learned about automated extraction tools and hive scales. Grandpa didn't always understand the tech, but he watched me with quiet pride. One evening, as the sky turned amber, I filmed him working with one of the calmer colonies. I posted it on the Instagram page I'd made for fun, Monroe Honey, named for nothing more than the name I still carried. The next morning, the video had thousands of views. Someone had shared it to a veterans support group. Messages started coming in. "Your story gave me hope. Thank you for showing us there's still life after war. My brother saw your video. He hasn't spoken in weeks. Today he asked me about bees." I read everyone, not knowing what to do with the feeling building in my chest. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something quieter, like maybe I mattered beyond what I could give. The nightmares still came. Some nights I woke shaking, but there'd be a cup of tea waiting and Grandpa's words from earlier that week still ringing in my ears. "Keep trying. That's enough." And for the first time, I believed him. They pulled up in a silver car. I didn't recognize the tires crunching over gravel like they were arriving at a vacation rental. My mother stepped out first, wearing a floral dress too bright for the season, a purse slung over her shoulder like it weighed nothing. My father followed, blazer-pressed hair combed stiff. His eyes moved over the farm like he was appraising it. I stood at the edge of the field, a hive frame still in my hands, sweat on my shirt. I didn't say anything, just watched. Elias, my mother, called as if no time had passed. "We saw your videos. You've done so well." She smiled too wide. We thought, maybe it's time we all started over. As a family. Grandpa stepped up beside me, his boots firm in the dirt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Did you think we wouldn't see through you?" He said, his gaze sharp and still. My father cleared his throat. "We were wrong, all right, but we're here now. We want to make things right." I set the frame down slowly. My voice came steady, more steady than I expected. "When I needed love," I said, "you gave me bills. When I needed space to heal, you gave me shame. And now that I've found peace, you want." In my mother's smile cracked just slightly. My father shifted his hands, twitching like he wanted to grab the words back. But I was done. "You're too late." Grandpa nodded, once silent, and they turned without another word. The car backed out, disappearing down the road. I didn't feel angry, not sad either, just light, like something heavy had finally been cut loose. I turned back to the hives and kept working because there was still sweetness to tend to. Micah arrived on a gray afternoon with a duffel bag and a tentative smile. He looked older than I remembered, but still had that same way of walking, like he was trying not to take up too much space. We didn't say much at first, just a long hug on the porch and a quiet "I'm sorry" that carried more weight than any long apology could. He slipped into life on the farm without a ripple. Learned fast, asked questions, stayed up late, running ideas by me and Grandpa. He talked about beeswax lip balms, hand creams, even experienced tours where families could visit and learn about hive life. I listened, surprised by how much he'd been thinking, how much he clearly wanted to give back, not just to me, but to what we were building. We launched the online shop a month later. Orders trickled in, then poured. Schools booked visits. Local papers called. Monroe Honey wasn't just a brand, it was a story people wanted to believe in. One morning, Grandpa handed me a worn notebook, the leather edges soft from years of handling. Inside were sketches, notes, beekeeping records from decades ago, and scattered between them dreams. Expansion plans, teaching goals, things he never got to chase. "You'll do what I couldn't," he said simply. We hired 2 part-time workers, good people, steady hands. Our table grew longer, our dinners louder. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the one I chose. At a veterans event that fall, I stood before a room full of strangers and told my story. Not the polished version, but the real one. I ended with I didn't just survive, I remade myself. Now I stand at the edge of the bee fields, watching a school bus unload kids toward the hives. Micah waves them over, explaining how the bees work together to build something strong. People say family is blood, but blood can betray you. Bees never abandon their own. And if the hive we build with our own hands is stronger than the one we were born into, does that make us less a son or more a man?